The day my sister stood up in front of 40 employees and announced that I had voluntarily signed over my shares of our father's company to her, I was sitting in the third row. She didn't know I was there. She also didn't know that every single word she had ever said to me, every threat, every manipulation, every late-night phone call where she laughed about what she was doing, was saved on a hard drive sitting in my apartment. Encrypted and backed up in 3 separate cloud locations. She had spent 8 months dismantling my life. It took me 8 months to build the cage she walked into. My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the quiet one, not the invisible one. I want to be clear about that. My father saw me. He always saw me. But in the architecture of our family, I was the background character while my sister Diane was the main event. Diane is 4 years older than me, and from the moment she could walk, she understood something I didn't. That attention was a resource, and she was going to extract every drop of it from every room she entered. She was loud, where I was thoughtful. She was dramatic, where I was steady. She charmed people immediately, and they loved her for it, and she knew exactly how to use that love like a tool. My father's name was Gerald. He built a mid-sized logistics and supply chain consulting firm from a single truck and a rented desk in 1989. By the time I was born, he had 40 employees. By the time I graduated college, he had over 200, 3 regional offices, and contracts with some of the largest retail distributors on the East Coast. He was not flashy about it. He drove the same pickup truck for 11 years. He packed his lunch in a blue thermos every single morning. He coached my youth soccer team even during the years the company was hemorrhaging money and he was working 18-hour days to keep it alive. My mother passed when I was 9. A brain aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon in October. After that, it was just the 3 of us, Dad, Diane, and me. And for a while, grief made us close. But grief also has a way of revealing who people really are once the softness of it fades. Diane, as she grew older, became increasingly focused on the company. Not because she loved logistics. Not because she cared about the employees, or the clients, or the decades of trust my father had built. She cared about what it represented: money, status, and power. She started working there full-time after college, maneuvering herself into a VP role by the time she was 28. She was good at her job, I'll admit that. She was sharp and she was strategic, but she was also ruthless in ways that made the employees nervous around her. And she had a habit of taking credit for other people's work that was so well practiced it had almost become invisible. I took a different path. I studied accounting, then got my CPA license, then spent several years working for a regional audit firm where I specialized in forensic accounting, which in simple terms means I spent my professional life learning how to find the money people tried to hide. I joined my father's company 6 years ago, not as a favor to family, but because he asked me specifically. He was getting older. He wanted someone he trusted to watch the numbers. He set it up so that Diane ran operations and I oversaw the financial controls, and for a while, not a perfect while, but a functional while, it worked. Diane resented me being there, but she tolerated it. What she didn't know was that from almost my first week, I noticed things. Small things. A vendor invoice that was slightly off. An expense report with a receipt that didn't quite match the date. A consulting fee paid to a company I'd never heard of. I didn't say anything immediately. I documented it. That's what forensic accountants do. We don't react, we record. And over the course of my first 2 years, what I recorded painted a very uncomfortable picture. But I loved my father. I did not want to devastate him with what I was seeing. So I waited, and I watched, and I documented, and I hoped that maybe I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. My father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 3 years ago. He didn't tell Diane and me at the same time. He told me first, alone, on a Sunday afternoon in his kitchen, and he held my hand across the table and said, "I need you to promise me something, Nora." I promised before he even finished the sentence. Because that's who he was to me, the kind of person you trust completely before the ask. What he asked was this: he wanted me to make sure the company stayed intact. He had spent 30 years building something that employed real people with real families, and his deepest fear was that it would be sold off or stripped for parts by someone who saw it as a transaction rather than a legacy. He didn't say Diane's name. He didn't have to. I held his hand and I told him I would protect it. And I meant it with every part of me. 6 months after his diagnosis, Dad began working with his estate attorney to update his documents. He was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about everything. He had built a structure that was genuinely fair. He split ownership of the company equally between Diane and me. with a board seat allocated to a trusted outside advisor to prevent deadlock, and a clear clause that neither of us could sell or transfer shares without written, notarized consent from the other. It was clean, it was balanced. It was exactly like him. Diane found out about the split when his attorney sent preliminary documents for review. I was not in the room when she read them, but I heard about it from my father that evening, and the way he described her reaction, quiet, still, her eyes going flat, told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. The campaign started slowly. First, she began excluding me from meetings. Not obviously, she'd simply forget to send calendar invites, or schedule things at the last minute when she knew I had conflicts. When I raised it, she smiled and said, "Nora, I had no idea you wanted to be involved in operations strategy." Then she started undermining me with the staff. Little things at first. Questioning my decisions in front of junior employees. Laughing lightly when I made a point in a group setting, just enough to signal that my words were slightly ridiculous. She introduced me to a new client once, a major potential partner, and said, "This is my sister Nora. She handles the bookkeeping. I am a licensed forensic CPA with a specialty that most small firms never even employ. Bookkeeping." I smiled and shook the client's hand and said nothing. I went home and I added it to the document I had been keeping. Then Dad had a fall. It wasn't catastrophic, a stumble on his back porch, a sprained wrist, a bruised pride, but it shook him. The Parkinson's was progressing faster than expected, and the fall scared him in a way the diagnosis alone hadn't. He began stepping back from the office. He came in 2 days a week, then 1 day, then not at all. He trusted us to handle it. And the moment he was fully out of the building, Diane stopped being subtle. She moved fast, I'll give her that. She restructured the reporting hierarchy so that every department head reported directly to her, bypassing the checks my father had put in place. She replaced 2 long-term managers who had been close to Dad with people she had hired herself. She renegotiated our company's arrangement with our primary vendor, a company I had been suspicious of for years, and not only renewed the contract but significantly increased the volume. That vendor, as I had documented over the previous 4 years, was owned by a man named Patrick, who happened to be Diane's college boyfriend and who had resurfaced in her life about 18 months prior. The invoices from Patrick's company were consistently about 12% above market rate. The difference, annualized, was approximately $340,000 per year being drained from a company my father had bled for. But the worst, the thing that made me sit in my car in the company parking garage and cry for 20 minutes, was what she did with my father's trust. She went to visit him, alone, multiple times, during the period when he was most disoriented from a medication adjustment. I didn't find out about these visits until later, from his home health aide, who mentioned them casually and had no idea there was anything unusual about them. During those visits, as I would eventually piece together, she had spoken to him about the company. She had planted seeds. She had told him, gently, repeatedly, in the careful voice of a loving daughter, that I wasn't really engaged with the business, that I was thinking about leaving, that I had said things to her privately about wanting out. None of it was true, but he was medicated and frightened and aging. And she was his firstborn, and she had always been the one who filled the room. And some part of him, I believe this, didn't want to disbelieve her because it was easier not to. I found out about the forged signature for months into this campaign. Our father's estate attorney, a cautious and precise man named Mr. Holt, called me on a Wednesday morning and asked if I could come in. His voice was careful in a way that told me whatever he was about to say, he had been dreading it. I sat across from him in his office, and he slid a document across the desk. It was a share transfer agreement. It bore my signature. I had never seen it before in my life. The signature was mine, or close enough to mine that I stared at it for a long time before I could fully accept what I was looking at. Diane had filed it 3 weeks earlier with a notarization stamp from a notary I didn't recognize. A woman named Claire who turned out, upon later investigation, to be a former college roommate of Diane's who had gotten her notary license the year before. The document transferred my 50% ownership stake to Diane in full, citing my voluntary and informed decision to exit the business. Mr. Holt watched me across the desk. He said, quietly, "I wanted you to know before I processed this." I asked him how long he had before he was legally required to act on it. He said he had some discretion, given the irregularities he'd already noticed. I told him I needed time. He gave me 2 weeks. I drove home. I did not cry. I was past crying. That night I sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours without moving. I'm not being dramatic when I say that, I genuinely sat there. with a cold cup of tea in front of me, and I went through every memory I had of my sister and tried to find the moment it had become this. Was it when Dad was diagnosed? Was it before that? Was there ever a version of Diane who was capable of being something other than this? I thought about my father, sitting in his house, watching the bird feeder he'd installed on his back porch, not knowing that his older daughter had forged his younger daughter's signature to steal what he had so carefully and lovingly divided between them. That was the part that broke something in me. Not the money. Not even the company. The fact that she had gone to him, frail, medicated, scared, and used his love for her as a lever. I called my best friend Maya that night. Maya had known me since we were 12, and she had met Diane exactly once and come home and told me, with the bluntness that only a 12-year-old can achieve, "Your sister is going to be a problem someday." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is the thing I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So what are you going to do?" And something shifted in me when she asked that. Not a dramatic shift, not a movie moment with swelling music, just a quiet click, somewhere in my chest, like a lock turning. What was I going to do? I was a forensic accountant. I had spent 8 months documenting financial irregularities. I had 4 years of data. I had a forged signature and a notary whose credentials were traceable, and a vendor relationship that was, at minimum, a significant conflict of interest and, at maximum, a fraud. I had a father whose trust had been manipulated, and an estate attorney who had shown me the document before processing it, which meant he had his own doubts. I had everything. I just hadn't used it yet. I sat up straighter in my chair. I picked up the cold cup of tea. I started making a list. The first call I made the next morning was to a lawyer. Not a family lawyer, not a real estate attorney, but a corporate litigation specialist named David Reyes, who had been recommended to me by a colleague 2 years earlier. After I'd helped uncover a fraud at one of our mutual clients, I laid out everything for him in a single 2-hour meeting, with my documentation organized in chronological order in a binder I had assembled the night before. He read through it quietly, page by page, occasionally asking a question. When he finished, he set the binder down and looked at me. "How long have you been building this?" he asked. 4 years for the financial irregularities, I said. 8 months for everything else. He nodded slowly. "The forged signature alone is a crime," he said. "But what you have here is significantly larger than one crime." He explained the landscape to me clearly. The forged signature and false notarization was document fraud, a felony in our state. The vendor relationship, given the evidence I had compiled about the price discrepancy and Diane's personal connection to the vendor, was potentially a breach of fiduciary duty and, depending on how the money was structured, could rise to the level of embezzlement. The manipulation of our father during a period of documented cognitive impairment for the purpose of influencing his estate was undue influence, a civil claim that could invalidate any changes made to his documents during that period. And there was one more thing David flagged, which I hadn't even considered the full weight of. If Diane had taken the above actions in her capacity as an officer of the company itself had potential claims against her that were separate from and independent of any personal claims I might have. I was not just one wronged daughter. I was a 50% owner of a company that had potentially been defrauded by its own VP of operations. That changed the geometry of everything. We mapped out a plan that was careful and sequential. Step 1 was to secure my father, not in a dramatic way, not by alarming him or confronting him, but by ensuring that any further visits from Diane during sensitive periods were documented, and by quietly looping in his physician about the potential for undue influence given his condition. His doctor, who was already monitoring his cognitive state, took that conversation seriously. He made a note in the file. Step 2 was the financial investigation. I had 4 years of documented irregularities, but David wanted a clean, formal report, the kind that would hold up in court or in a regulatory filing, so I spent 3 weeks compiling everything into a structured forensic report. The same kind I had produced dozens of times for external clients. I was meticulous. Every discrepancy cross-referenced, every vendor invoice compared to market rate, every payment traced through the accounts. The final number for the vendor overcharge over 4 years was $1.1 million. I typed that number and I had to sit with it for a moment. $1.1 million. Drained from something my father had built with 30 years of 5 a.m. mornings and packed lunches and missed weekends. Step 3 was the notary. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Sandra who worked primarily on financial cases and who David trusted completely. Within a week, Sandra had confirmed that Claire, the notary on the forged document, was indeed Diane's former roommate. She had also found 2 other documents notarized by Claire that appeared in county records, both connected to Diane, both dated within the past 18 months. One was a property deed amendment. I won't go into detail here, but it was significant. Step 4 was the most important, and the most delicate. I needed to continue showing up to work as if nothing had changed. This was the hardest part. Every morning, I drove into that parking garage and walked through those glass doors and sat in my office and reviewed spreadsheets and attended the meetings Diane bothered to invite me to, and I smiled and I was professional and I gave absolutely nothing away. Diane, for her part, had begun treating me with a particular kind of warmth, the bright, slightly patronizing warmth of someone who believes they have already won. She asked my opinion on things. She CC'd me on emails. She was performing magnanimity, and it was almost impressive. She had filed that transfer document and she was waiting for it to process. And in the meantime, she was being kind to me the way you're kind to someone you're about to fire. I let her perform. I smiled back. I kept my phone in my chest pocket, the recording app open. I want to be clear about this. The recordings were done in full compliance with my state's one-party consent laws, which I had verified with David before I started. I was a party to every conversation I recorded. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Over those 8 weeks, I collected 14 recordings. The most significant was a phone call. She called me, I did not call her, in which she said, and I am going to paraphrase rather than quote directly, she told me that the transfer was almost processed. That she was glad I had finally made the right choice, and that once everything was settled, she'd make sure I had a comfortable consulting arrangement that would keep me in the loop without any of the stress of ownership. She had invented a story in which I had willingly given up my shares. She was so committed to this story that she had begun telling it to me as though it were the truth. I said very little in that call. I said, I appreciate you thinking of me. And I wrote down the timestamp and saved the file. David filed 3 things simultaneously, on a Tuesday morning, 8 weeks after our first meeting. The first was a civil complaint in the county court, naming Diane personally and the company as co-defendants, alleging document fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil theft, citing the $1.1 million in identified overcharges and the conflict of interest vendor relationship. The second was a formal complaint to the state's Notary Regulatory Board, with the full evidence package regarding Claire and her notarization of the fraudulent transfer document, including the 2 other questionable documents Sandra had identified. The third was a certified letter to the company's board of directors, which, per our father's structure, consisted of 2 family representatives and 1 independent outside advisor, formally requesting an emergency board meeting and presenting a summary of the forensic report. David had timed the filings so that they would all land before noon on the same day. I was in my office when they hit. I know they hit because, at 12:47 p.m., Diane's executive assistant knocked on my door and said, very carefully, Nora, Diane is asking if you have a moment. I looked up from my desk. I said, of course. Diane's office was at the end of the hall. A large corner office she had redecorated the week after. Dad stepped back, replacing his old oak furniture with something sleeker and more expensive. She was standing when I walked in, which was unusual. She normally stayed seated. Her phone was on the desk, and she was gripping the edge of the desk with both hands, and her face was doing something complicated, cycling through expressions too fast for any one of them to fully land. What did you do? She said. Her voice was very quiet. I sat down in the chair across from her desk. She had not offered me the chair. I sat down anyway. I protected the company, I said. The way Dad asked me to. You filed a lawsuit, yes, against me. Against you, and against the company, for the recovery of the assets. She stared at me. You can't prove anything, she said. It was the wrong thing to say, and I think some part of her knew it was the wrong thing to say even as she said it. Because if there was nothing to prove, you don't say you can't prove it. You say there's nothing there. I have 4 years of invoices and a forensic report, I said. A phone recording of you referencing the transfer as though I had consented to it. A private investigator's report connecting Claire to you. And the testimony of Dad's home health aide regarding your unsupervised visits during his medication adjustment period. The color left her face. I watched it go. The notary complaint will likely result in Claire losing her license, I continued. David tells me the DA's office in this county takes document fraud seriously, particularly when it involves estate documents of an elderly person with a documented cognitive condition. She sat down. She sat down the way people sit when their legs simply stop working. Nora, she said, and her voice had changed. The boardroom voice was gone, replaced with something thinner and younger. We're family. I had been waiting for those words. I had known they were coming. I had rehearsed exactly how I would feel when I heard them, and I had decided, weeks before that moment, that I would not be cruel. I was not there to be cruel. I was there to be clear. We are family, I said. And you forged my signature on a legal document. You drained over $1 million from something Dad built by exploiting a relationship with a vendor you have a personal conflict with. You went to our father, our sick, medicated father, and you lied to him about me, repeatedly, to manipulate his perception of me, because you wanted what he built for both of us, all for yourself. Family is the reason I waited as long as I did. It is not a reason to ignore what you did. She didn't say anything. And I stood up, and I left her office, and I walked back down the hall to mine. My hands were steady. I was surprised by how steady my hands were. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following week. David attended with me. Diane came with her own attorney, a fact that spoke for itself in the room. The independent board advisor, a man named George who had served on the board for 9 years and who I had always liked, had received the forensic report in advance. And the way he sat at that table told me he had read every page. I presented the report myself. I walked through it section by section, the vendor relationship, the timeline of overcharges, the documentation of Diane's personal connection to the vendor owner, the forged transfer document, the notary irregularities. I was calm. I was precise. I had presented forensic findings in adversarial settings before. This was no different, except that the person on the other side of the table was someone who used to steal Halloween candy from my bag when we were children. And tell me the tooth fairy had taken it. Diane's attorney objected to several things. George overruled all of them. At the end of the presentation, George asked Diane directly if she had anything to say in response to the forensic findings. She said she disputed the characterization of the vendor relationship. George nodded and wrote something down. He asked if she disputed the signature on the transfer document. There was a long pause. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. She said she had no comment on that at this time. George nodded again. The board voted, that day, to suspend Diane from her operational role pending the outcome of the litigation. The vote was 2-1. I was the second vote. What happened next happened quickly, the way things do when the structure holding them up is removed. Diane's attorney reached out to David 2 days after the board meeting. They wanted to discuss a settlement. I want to be very clear about what I did and did not want from that settlement. I did not want to punish Diane financially beyond what was fair. I did not want to put my sister in prison, though I want to be equally clear that the decision about whether that happened was not entirely mine to make. The DA's office had been notified and was conducting their own review. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my shares back, correctly and legally. I wanted full restitution of the vendor overcharges to be repaid to the company. I wanted Diane removed from any operational role in the company, and I wanted a formally documented acknowledgement that the transfer document was fraudulent. David negotiated on my behalf. It took 3 weeks. In the end, Diane agreed to all 4 terms. The restitution was structured over 4 years. Because she did not have $1.1 million liquid, though where exactly the money had gone was a question I chose not to pursue further. Partly for my father's sake, the DA's office, for their part, determined that the document fraud charges would be addressed through a deferred prosecution agreement. Provided Diane met the restitution terms and completed a formal compliance program. Claire lost her notary license. Patrick's vendor contract was terminated. And on a quiet Friday afternoon, I walked into Mr. Holt's office and watched him void the fraudulent transfer document in the system and restore my name to the shareholder record exactly as my father had written it. I told Dad about it. Not all of it, not the recordings, not the boardroom vote, not the things Diane had said to him during those visits. I told him that there had been some financial irregularities at the company. That I had found them because that is my job, and that they had been corrected. He sat across from me at his kitchen table, the same table where he had told me about his diagnosis, and he looked at me for a long time. Was it Diane? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. The company is fine, Dad, I said. Your employees are fine. Everything you built is intact. He nodded slowly. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, the same way he had when he asked me to protect it. I know I asked a lot of you, he said. I shook my head. You asked me to do what I'm good at, I said. That's not asking a lot. The confrontation, the real one, the one I hadn't planned, happened at my father's 71st birthday dinner, 3 months after the settlement. I had not expected Diane to come. She had been staying away from family gatherings, and I had let her stay away, because the logistics of being in the same room with her, while all of this was still being processed, felt too complicated. But she came. She arrived 40 minutes late, while we were already at the table, and she sat down across from me without meeting my eyes. Dad was having a good night, clearer than usual, more present. He was telling a story about the early days of the company that I had heard at least 15 times. And I was laughing in all the right places because I love that story, because it is a story about who he is. Diane sat quietly through dinner. She ate, she answered when Dad spoke to her. She did not speak to me. And then, near the end of the meal, Dad mentioned casually, the way he mentioned most things, that he had spoken to Mr. Holt recently about the estate documents. "Everything's in order," he said, looking at both of us. "Just the way I wanted it." Diane put down her fork. She looked at me for the first time that evening. I held her gaze. In her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected, not anger, not defiance, but something smaller and sadder than both of those things. I think it was the look of someone seeing very clearly, possibly for the first time, what they had almost done, what they had almost destroyed. Not just the company. Our father's last years, the thing he had loved most. She looked away first. She pushed her chair back and excused herself to the kitchen. When she came back, the look was gone, replaced with the performance, the practiced warmth, the smooth surface. But I had seen it, and I thought, maybe that is enough. Maybe not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. I am still deciding, but acknowledgement. She had seen what she had done. She knew that I knew. She knew that I had chosen not to burn her completely to the ground, and she would have to live with understanding why I made that choice, which was not mercy for her sake, but love for our fathers. My life today looks different than it did 18 months ago. I am now CFO of my father's company, a title I suggested to the board, and which George seconded immediately. The vendor contract savings alone paid for a new health benefits package that covered 2 things. Every one of our 200 employees had been requesting for years. I promoted one of the managers Diane had pushed out, a woman named Keisha who had been with the company for 14 years and who, given actual support, turned out to be one of the best operational minds in the building. I visit my father on Sundays. We sit in his kitchen and drink coffee, and he tells me stories, and I listen to all of them, even the ones I've heard 15 times. Because one day there will be a Sunday when I can't hear them anymore, and I want to have listened to every single one. Diane and I are not close. I don't know if we will ever be close. She is complying with the restitution schedule, and we exchange professional communications when necessary. And at family events, we are polite to each other in the way of people who are making a choice to be civil because someone they both love is in the room. That is not a fairy tale resolution. But it is an honest one. I don't think the goal of justice is happiness. I think the goal of justice is accuracy, restoring things to what they actually are, rather than what someone tried to make them appear to be. My father built something real. Diane tried to rewrite the story of it, to make it hers alone by erasing me from the page. I just made sure the original document survived. There is one more thing I want to say, for anyone reading this who recognizes some version of their own situation in mine. There will be people in your life, sometimes people who share your blood, who mistake your gentleness for weakness, who look at the fact that you haven't said anything and decide that you don't know, who assume that because you are quiet, you are unaware. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can be is quietly competent for a very long time. The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They are showing you exactly who they are while you are still in a position to do something about it. Do not react. Document. Do not confront. Prepare. And when the moment comes, when the screen is already loaded and all they have to do is walk into the room, be ready, be precise, be legal, and do not be cruel, because cruelty is for people who are still angry, and you will not be angry by then. You will be ready. My sister thought she was inheriting a company. What she actually inherited was the proof that she had tried to take it. My father thought he was leaving us something to share. What he actually left me was the reason to fight for it. And the day I walked out of Mr. Holt's office with my name back where it belonged, I didn't feel victorious. I felt like a daughter who had kept her promise. That was enough. That was everything.